What if the home you bought for $100 was never meant to be lived in at all? What if your loyal dog kept warning you about something hidden beneath the floor? And when you finally listened, you uncovered a secret powerful people tried to bury for decades. This is the journey of David Miller, a tired veteran, and Max the dog who uncovered the truth and turned a cursed cabin into a place of hope. I hope you enjoy this story filled with courage and healing. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below and subscribe. The morning sky carried a pale, washed out color, and a thin line of cold wind drifted across the empty highway. The air was dry and carried the scent of dust and old asphalt. The sun hid behind a muted layer of clouds, as if unsure whether it should rise or stay hidden. It was the kind of quiet day that felt tired even before it began. David Miller sat behind the wheel of a battered pickup truck parked behind a grocery store. The truck was a faded blue, with large patches of rust along the doors and hood. The engine coughed each time he turned the key, and the radio had stopped working months ago. David was about 40, broad-shouldered, with dark brown hair trimmed short. His beard was uneven because he shaved only when he found an available restroom. His eyes were gray and carried a heaviness that seemed older than he was, the kind that came from too many nights spent awake during deployment and too many mornings spent wrestling with memories he would rather forget. He had been a soldier for most of his adult life, and the war left marks that never showed on skin, but shaped every breath he took. Beside him lay Max, a 6-year-old German shepherd with thick, dark fur and amber eyes that watched David with quiet loyalty. Max had served with him overseas and carried a scar on his left flank from a desert mission years ago. The dog had a calm and steady nature, protective but gentle. When nightmares pulled David awake in the middle of the night, Max would press close and steady his breathing with warm weight and slow rhythm. Max was more than a companion. He was the last piece of the life David once understood. David rubbed his face with both hands and leaned back in the stiff truck seat. He wore a faded work jacket with frayed cuffs and jeans that had been patched 3 times. His boots were worn down at the heel. On the passenger floorboard sat 2 plastic bags holding canned food, a half-empty bottle of water, and a small bag of kibble for Max. There was not much else. Most of David's belongings had been sold or pawned to cover the constantly rising stack of bills. His VA benefits had been delayed again, a notice he reread so many times the edges curled. The delay was described in soft, polite words, but to him it simply meant he had to survive without support. The last time he paid rent had been months ago. When he could not make the next payment, he had slept in the truck for a few days, thinking it was temporary. A few days turned into weeks. Eventually, temporary became normal. Each morning, he drove through town looking for day labor. He lifted crates in warehouses, swept construction sites, carried lumber for contractors willing to pay in cash. The pay was small and unpredictable, but it helped him and Max get through another day. Some foremen looked at him with sympathy, some with impatience. A few recognized the fatigues he once wore and softened their tone. But none of the jobs lasted long enough to give him anything close to stability. David looked at the empty parking lot stretching behind the store. Trash rolled across the pavement, pushed by the wind. His breath carried a slight tremble as he exhaled. The tightness in his chest, familiar and unwelcome, settled like a stone beneath his ribs. Some mornings, he woke with a sense of clarity. This morning was not one of them. He rested a hand on Max's head. The dog lifted his gaze and nudged David's arm with gentle pressure. David let out a long, slow breath. The presence of Max always pulled him away from the darker edges of his thoughts. He often wondered what would have happened to him if the dog had not been there. Memories from the battlefield still rose without warning. The sound of distant explosions. The sudden shift of sand under his boots. The weight of his gear, and the constant awareness that danger could break the silence at any second. Civilian life felt strangely unreal after that, like he had stepped into a play without knowing the script. He opened the truck door and stepped out into the cold air. Max followed beside him, paws landing soft and steady on the concrete. David stretched his back, wincing as a familiar ache traveled across his spine. Injuries from deployment, barely treated because the missions never slowed long enough for rest. Those pains stayed with him long after the uniform came off. He walked to a nearby dumpster and threw away an empty can. When he turned back, Max was sitting near the truck, looking up at him with ears slightly raised, as if asking what their plan was for the day. David gave a small nod, as if answering the silent question. The truth was, he did not know. Every day felt like a fragile attempt to keep the pieces of his life from collapsing. He got back into the truck and turned the key. The engine sputtered, rattled, then came to life with a groan. He checked the fuel gauge. It hovered just above empty. He had enough gas for one small drive. Maybe he could find another warehouse job, or a day shift cleaning lots on the industrial side of town. Maybe someone would need a hand with loading work. Or maybe he would find nothing and return to the same parking spot at sunset with only a few dollars left. As he pulled out of the lot, the sky brightened slightly, though the sun stayed hidden behind thin clouds. The wind picked up and pushed dry leaves across the road. David drove slowly, careful not to waste fuel. Max sat upright now, head near the open window, ears twitching at every sound outside. His alertness always brought David a strange comfort. If Max felt safe, it meant the world was still manageable. David passed rows of small houses worn by time. He glanced at the porches and saw men drinking coffee before work and women guiding children to school buses. Scenes that once felt normal now appeared distant, like looking through a window into a life he no longer belonged to. He clenched his jaw and forced his thoughts back to the moment. He drove toward the industrial district. The smell of machine oil hung in the air. A few workers gathered near a loading dock. David pulled over, approached them carefully, and asked if they needed an extra hand. The supervisor, a tall man with a round face and tired eyes, looked him up and down. The man introduced himself as Mark, and though his voice carried weariness, it also carried a hint of understanding. He shook his head slowly and said they had filled their spots for the day. Mark noticed Max sitting quietly by the truck and gave a faint friendly nod toward the dog, then returned to his clipboard. It was not hostility, just another closed door. David walked back to the truck, feeling the weight settle deeper across his shoulders. Max picked up on his mood and brushed his head against David's arm. The simple gesture helped ease the sting of disappointment. He got back in the truck, placed his hands on the steering wheel, and let his forehead rest against it. For a moment he stayed still, listening to the low hum of the engine, trying to breathe past the knot forming in his chest. He remembered nights overseas when he felt this same pressure. a sense of being trapped between fear and exhaustion. Back then, he had a mission and a team beside him. Now, he had only a dog and a truck he hoped would start again tomorrow. A thought crossed his mind, quiet but persistent. If the benefits had arrived on time, if the nightmares loosened their grip, if he found a steady job, perhaps things would feel different. But he pushed the thought away. Wishing for another life did not build the one he had. He looked at Max and managed a faint, tired smile. The dog wagged his tail once as if reminding him that they still had each other. That was the only thing that kept David from slipping too far into despair. Max had stayed with him through sandstorms and gunfire. Now the dog stayed with him through poverty and uncertainty. Loyalty was a quiet thing, but powerful. And in this life, it mattered more than anything else. He drove to the edge of town, where a small rest stop sat empty. He parked beneath a tree and turned off the engine to save the last drops of fuel. The silence felt heavy at first, then settled into something calmer. Max curled up on the seat beside him. David leaned back and closed his eyes. He listened to the slow, even breathing of the dog and let it steady him. The world was still hard and the future still uncertain, but as long as Max rested by his side, he knew he was not entirely alone. For now, that was enough. There was no home to return to and no job waiting. But there was a companionship that had survived both war and the long, hollow months that followed. David let out a long breath. He did not know how he would fix his life or where the next day would lead. But in this quiet moment, with Max warm beside him, he allowed himself a small, fragile sense of peace. The afternoon sky turned a dull silver as storm clouds drifted low across the hills. A soft curtain of rain swept down the road in thin, wavering lines. The wind carried a faint chill and the scent of wet earth. The world felt quiet and suspended, as if holding its breath before the heavier rain arrived. David Miller drove slowly along the narrow two-lane road, the windshield wipers of his old truck dragging in uneven strokes. Max rested in the passenger seat beside him, ears angled back each time a gust of wind pushed against the truck. The air inside smelled faintly of damp fabric and old metal. David felt the familiar heaviness in his chest as he tried to plan the next few days and found no clear path ahead. He had almost no money left and no steady work. Each mile he drove felt like a question he could not answer. The rain grew heavier and forced him to pull over at a small roadside diner. The building was a low structure with a red metal roof. The paint on the walls had faded from years of storms. Inside, the lights glowed warm through the windows. David guided the truck beneath the overhang and killed the engine. Max stood and stretched, tail swaying once in quiet approval of being out of the wind. David stepped out and felt the rain immediately seep into his jacket. He hurried inside with Max close behind. A tiny bell above the door chimed softly as he entered. The diner smelled of coffee, bacon grease, and rain-soaked clothing. A few tables were empty. Only a single waitress moved behind the counter. She was a woman in her late 50s, with short gray hair and a sturdy build. Her face carried gentle lines and an expression that suggested she had seen many tired travelers come through her doors. She wore a clean apron and moved with an efficient rhythm that spoke of long years working early mornings. She looked up when David entered, gave a small nod, and said in a calm, steady tone that he could choose any seat. David picked a booth near the window. Max settled beside him on the floor. The waitress brought a cup of coffee without asking. She set it down with a quiet understanding in her eyes, as if she recognized the tired weight in David's posture. Her name tag read Nora. She spoke little, but her presence carried the quiet patience of someone who understood hardship without needing explanation. As David wrapped his hands around the warm cup, a small bulletin board near the entrance caught his attention. It was cluttered with handwritten notes for odd jobs, garage sales, lost dogs, and faded flyers from events long past. Yet one sheet stood out. It was a simple piece of white paper held up by a thumbtack. The ink had smudged slightly from moisture, but the message was clear. Old forest cabin for sale. $100. Located on township land. As is. The number at the bottom belonged to the local clerk's office. David stared at the flyer with a sense of disbelief. $100. He had just enough to cover that amount, but little more. He turned the idea over in his mind and felt a flicker of hope rise in his chest. It was fragile and small, but it was real. A place to sleep under a roof instead of in a truck. A place that was his, even if broken and old. Nora noticed him looking at the flyer. She approached with a coffee pot and refilled his cup. Her voice lowered in a cautious tone as she said that the cabin had been abandoned for decades and that most folks in town stayed away from it. She did not elaborate, but her eyes shifted briefly toward the window as if remembering something unpleasant. She added that storms hit the forest hard and the place might not be safe. Her words were not dramatic, just a quiet warning shaped by long local memory. David thanked her with a tired nod. The warning sat in his mind, but did not replace the simple truth. He needed shelter. He needed a place to stop drifting. Even a broken cabin was better than a parking lot. Max seemed to sense the shift in David's thoughts. He nudged David's knee with his nose, then looked toward the door as if reminding him that decisions always had consequences. After finishing the coffee, David stepped back into the rain and reached for his phone. He dialed the number from the flyer. A man answered with a weary voice. He introduced himself as the township clerk. The clerk sounded surprised that anyone was interested in the place. He explained that the cabin was so deteriorated that the town had priced it as low as possible. It was not meant to be attractive. It was simply a burden they hoped someone would take. The paperwork was simple and could be handled immediately. David felt a small tremor of relief. He confirmed he would come by. When he hung up the phone, he sat still for a moment inside the truck. The rain drummed on the roof like distant footsteps. Max watched him with steady amber eyes. David rested his hand on the dog's head and murmured to himself that this might be their chance. A thin, fragile chance, but still a direction. He drove to the township office. The building was a squat brick structure with peeling paint. Inside, the clerk was a thin man in his late 60s with a stooped posture. He had wispy white hair, combed carefully to one side, and wore thick glasses that magnified his pale blue eyes. His voice was soft and carried the tone of a man who had served the town for many years. He explained that the cabin was built generations ago, but had been abandoned after heavy winters damaged the roof and foundation. Most residents considered it unsafe. David listened carefully, though his focus remained on the possibility of having shelter. The clerk pushed forward a stack of simple forms. David signed them with slow, careful strokes. Max sat at his feet, ears shifting as if uncertain about the decision being made. When David handed over the $100, he felt the weight of parting with the last of his savings. but the thought of having a roof over his head steadied him. The clerk slid a small metal key across the desk. His expression shifted to something like concern. He spoke in a low tone that some locals believed the cabin carried old stories. He did not explain what kind of stories. He only said that a few people in the past had attempted to repair it, but always left before finishing. David sensed the man did not want to frighten him. It was merely the calm passing of a caution shaped by years of hearing the same whispers. David left the office with the key cold in his hand. The rain had slowed to a light mist. Max walked beside him, tail low, moving with quiet hesitation. The dog rarely showed fear. His unease made David pause. Max sniffed the air and gave a quiet, low whine, as if sensing something distant and uncertain. They returned to the truck, and David started the engine. He followed the clerk's directions toward the forest road. The pavement soon gave way to dirt. Raindrops clung to the leaves of tall pines that lined both sides. The road narrowed, and the world felt quieter with each passing mile. Max sat upright now, ears pricked, body tense. The dog stared ahead with an alertness that made David wonder what he was sensing. When the cabin finally came into view through the trees, David felt both relief and apprehension. The roof sagged. The wooden walls were darkened from age and storms. The porch leaned slightly as if burdened by time. Yet it was a real structure, a place where he could sleep out of the rain, a place that was his. Max let out a soft, uneasy bark, a sound gentle but filled with warning. David rested his hand on the dog's back and felt the tension beneath the fur. He looked at the cabin again. It was old and broken, but he had made his choice. He whispered quietly to Max that they would be careful. Then he stepped out of the truck and stood in front of the cabin. The wind rustled through the trees in slow, wavering breaths. The place felt forgotten and heavy with time. But for now, it was home. The late afternoon sky carried a soft gray glow as thin clouds drifted across the ridge. A cool breeze moved through the valley and rustled the tops of the pines. The light felt muted and calm, as if the day was settling into a long, gentle sigh. Everything around the forest road appeared washed in pale color and quiet air. David Miller drove toward the center of the small town with Max sitting upright beside him. The truck rattled over uneven pavement as they approached the narrow streets lined with old wooden buildings. David tried to steady his breath. He had the key to the cabin in his jacket pocket, and the thought of completing the paperwork should have brought relief. Instead, he felt a slow, prickling tension rise in his chest. He sensed that the town carried its own silent weight. The main street was simple and worn. A grocery store with peeling paint stood near a hardware shop with a faded sign. A small bakery released a faint smell of warm bread that drifted through the air. A few people walked along the sidewalk, carrying bags or pushing carts. Their steps slowed when they noticed David's truck. Their eyes followed him with an expression that did not fit any single emotion. There was curiosity mixed with cautious distance, and beneath that, a subtle shade of pity that he felt deep in his bones. He parked in front of the town hall. The building was a square structure of old bricks, weathered by years of storms. Flags hung quietly beside the door. Max jumped out first and waited beside him, alert but calm. David held the strap of his worn jacket and walked toward the entrance. His boots echoed softly in the hallway as he stepped inside. Behind the front desk sat a young woman with dark red hair pulled into a loose bun. She had pale, freckled skin and round brown eyes that seemed gentle at first glance, but sharpened with quick awareness when she looked at him. Her name tag read Lily. She greeted him with a polite tone, though her voice carried a quiet hesitation. Lily was slender and moved with the cautious precision of someone who had learned to read people before speaking. Her gaze flickered toward Max and softened slightly as she noted his calm posture. David explained he needed to confirm the purchase and finalize the registration for the cabin. Lily nodded and handed him a clipboard with thin sheets of paper. As he signed, she watched in silence, her expression shifting to something like concern. She asked if he had seen the property yet. When he answered yes, she paused, as though choosing her words carefully. Her tone lowered as she mentioned that the place had a long history, and that locals tended not to visit that part of the forest. She said it without judgment, only with the softness of someone offering a quiet truth. David thanked her and returned the paperwork. She pointed him toward an office at the end of the hall. The door was open, and behind a desk sat the town mayor. The man appeared to be in his mid-60s, with thick, silver hair combed neatly back. His frame was tall, but slightly bent at the shoulders, suggesting years of burdened responsibility. His face was lined with deep creases, and his eyes were a pale blue that carried both intelligence and exhaustion. He wore a simple dark jacket and spoke with a slow, even tone. His name was Mayor Whitaker. David introduced himself. The mayor studied him with a gaze that felt almost heavy, not threatening, but weighted with thoughts unspoken. Max sat at David's feet, ears shifting as though sensing the shift in the room. The mayor reached for a file and leafed through it with careful hands. He mentioned the cabin, and his voice grew measured, almost cautious. He said the structure had been abandoned for a long time, and that sometimes it was better to let certain parts of the past remain undisturbed. His words held no hard warning, only an unusual blend of sorrow and restraint, as if he was speaking from memory rather than instruction. David felt unease crawl quietly beneath his ribs. He nodded, unsure how to respond. The mayor closed the file gently and said that if David insisted on making the place livable, he should do so carefully. He did not explain further. The silence stretched for a moment before he dismissed David with a firm handshake. His palm was cool, and his expression softened into something like sympathy. Leaving the office, David walked back through the hallway with Max close beside him. He passed Lily again. She gave a small nod that carried a hint of regret, as though she wanted to say more but chose not to. Outside, the air had grown cooler. The clouds thickened, dimming the late daylight. As David walked toward his truck, he felt the weight of every quiet glance that had followed him through town. He sensed that the place held secrets not spoken aloud, secrets that the townspeople had learned to avoid. David drove back toward the forest road. The sky grew darker with each passing mile. Max shifted uneasily in the passenger seat, his ears twitching at distant sounds. The road narrowed into a path lined with tall pines. When the cabin finally appeared through the trees, David felt a tug in his chest. It was shabby and broken, but still his only chance at shelter. He parked beside the leaning porch and stepped out. The ground was damp from earlier rain. The air felt dense with the scent of wet wood. David pushed open the cabin door. Inside, the room was dim. Faint light slipped through cracked boards. Dust floated in the air like soft drifting ash. The floorboards creaked beneath his boots, and the old wooden walls gave off the smell of age and abandonment. He unpacked only what he needed: a thin blanket, a small flashlight, 2 cans of food, and Max's bowl. He cleared a corner near the wall, where the floorboards seemed less warped. Max circled twice before lying down, tail curled close to his body. The dog's breathing was steady, but his eyes stayed open. David sat beside him and leaned against the wall, the rough wood pressed against his back. He felt the day's softness fade into a heavier quiet. The fatigue in his limbs pulsed with dull ache. Yet the warnings from town echoed in his thoughts. Do not disturb the past. The mayor's voice clung to him like a shadow. Max suddenly lifted his head and stared toward the center of the room. His ears rose, and he gave a low sound deep in his throat. David followed his gaze. The dog's attention was fixed on a square portion of the floor where the planks formed a faint outline of what might once have been an entrance to a cellar. The wood there was darker, swollen from years of dampness. Max stood, took a cautious step forward, then stopped. A soft rumble rose in his chest, not in aggression, but in warning. David felt a subtle chill move across his skin. He reached out and placed a hand on Max's side. The dog stayed tense, eyes locked on the same spot. There was nothing visible, only the deep silence of an abandoned room. Yet Max's behavior stirred something uneasy inside David. He knew the dog's instincts were rarely wrong. Max had sensed danger in the desert long before any human saw it. Now that same alertness returned. David whispered quietly for Max to settle, though his own voice felt uncertain. The dog lay down again, but kept his head up, eyes unblinking. Outside, the wind pressed against the cabin walls in long, wavering breaths. The dim interior grew colder as evening approached. Shadows thickened in the corners. David pulled the blanket around his shoulders and watched the floor where Max had stared. He told himself it was only the creaking of an old structure, the smell of rot, the weight of years accumulated in silence. But a part of him felt the presence of something forgotten beneath the wooden boards, something the townspeople did not want disturbed. He lay down beside Max. The dog shifted closer, pressing his warm body against him. Darkness settled around them. For a moment, David allowed himself to imagine that tomorrow might be easier, that he could work through whatever repairs the cabin needed, that the warnings were only superstition. He closed his eyes, though the unease remained, quiet but persistent. Max stayed awake long after David drifted into restless sleep. His gaze fixed on the old hidden cellar beneath the floor. The night sky hung low with thick clouds as steady rain swept across the forest. Water dripped from the pine branches in slow rhythm, and the wind carried a cool, damp scent. The darkness outside the cabin felt heavy and dense, as if the world had folded into a quiet and unbroken gloom. Inside the small cabin, David Miller sat near the dim lantern he had placed on an overturned crate. The faint glow revealed peeling walls and warped wooden floorboards that shifted under every step. Max lay beside him, though his posture was tense. The dog kept raising his head to listen to distant sounds of wind or rain hitting the roof. David rubbed the back of his neck, feeling the exhaustion from days of uncertainty settling into his bones. The warnings from the town still circled in his thoughts, but fatigue had pushed everything into a dull haze. He finished a can of food and set the empty tin aside. Max watched him closely, with alert amber eyes. There was something restless in the dog's gaze, something David could not ignore. He reached down and ran a hand through Max's thick fur, hoping to calm him. But Max did not relax. The dog shifted, stood, and walked toward the darker side of the cabin, where the floorboards formed the faint outline of the old cellar opening. Max stopped there, ears forward, tail stiff, body leaning slightly toward the floor, as though he sensed something beneath. David felt unease creep toward him. He tried to call Max back with a soft voice, but Max remained fixed in place. Then the dog placed a paw on the floorboard. He rumbled a low sound deep in his throat, the same sound he once made in the desert when danger approached unseen. David felt the memory of those moments return like a cold shadow. Max pressed his paw again, then began to scrape at the wood. His nails made a sharp dragging sound as he dug with urgency that startled David. The dog rarely acted without reason. David stood and walked over, watching as Max continued to claw at the same plank with growing determination. Rain thudded on the roof harder now, and wind shook the cabin walls. But Max did not react to any of it. His focus was absolute. David knelt beside him. He pressed his hand against the floor. The wood felt damp and soft from years of neglect. He noticed now that one of the planks was slightly raised at the corner, warped just enough to form a small gap. Max looked at him with intense eyes, urging him to continue. David exhaled slowly, feeling a cold tightness settle in his chest. Something was beneath this floor, something the dog believed they needed to find. He pushed his fingers under the loose plank and pried upward. The wood groaned, splitting at the edges. He pulled again, using more force. The plank lifted with a muffled crack, and a stale smell of earth and metal drifted upward. Max leaned forward and sniffed urgently, tail rigid, muscles tense. David removed the plank completely and set it aside. Beneath it lay another layer of old boards, thinner and marked by water damage. Max pawed again, directing him. David removed the second plank with careful strength. When the last piece of wood came free, he saw a flat surface of rusted metal. It took him a moment to realize it was a door, square and weathered, fitted with an iron handle and covered in decades of dust and grime. A steel entrance beneath the floor. David froze, eyes locked on the discovery. His breathing deepened as he tried to understand what he was seeing. He thought of the mayor's quiet warning, of the clerk's hesitance, of the strange looks from the townspeople. A sense of dread settled into him, but curiosity pulled him forward with equal strength. He gripped the iron handle. The metal was cold and gritty. He pulled upward. At first, the door refused to move. He braced his foot and pulled again. The hinges creaked sharply, echoing through the small cabin. Dust scattered into the air. The door lifted with a heavy metallic groan, revealing a narrow passage of stone steps descending into darkness. Max let out a low sound, neither a growl nor a whine, but something in between, a sound shaped by instinct. David hesitated, staring down into the black space that seemed older than the cabin above it. He felt the air rise from below, stale and cool, carrying a scent of metal and forgotten years. He turned on his flashlight and aimed the beam downward. The stone steps stretched only a short distance before opening into a small room. The walls were built from rough stone blocks. Dust clung to every surface like a second layer of age. It was not a natural cellar. It was something built deliberately. David descended slowly. Max followed but stayed close behind him, muscles tense, breath slow and controlled. At the bottom of the steps, David swept the flashlight around the small room. The beam landed on a metal shelf pushed against the wall. On it sat a rectangular steel box, rusted and heavy. Beside it lay a stack of old folders and a bundle of photographs tied with a thin piece of string, now frayed. David approached with growing unease. He lifted the steel box. Its weight surprised him. He placed it on an old wooden table built into the wall. The top of the box slid open with a scrape. Inside lay papers yellowed with time, notes written in uneven handwriting, reports typed long ago, diagrams and charts that he could not immediately make sense of. He flipped through a folder. The words felt heavy and foreign. Mentions of controlled testing, references to experimental procedures, notes on volunteers who were not volunteers at all. The more he read, the tighter his chest grew. These were not harmless records. They described actions taken without consent. Names were listed. Ages, backgrounds. All of them belonged to people from the poorest parts of the region. He lifted the bundle of photographs. Black and white images stared back at him. People seated in small rooms with wires attached to their arms. Expressions empty or frightened. A few of the images showed groups of men standing together in formal coats. They appeared to be doctors or officials. Some stood with cold expressions, others with faint smiles that made the images feel even more unsettling. David felt a tremor move through him. The rain above grew louder, pounding on the cabin roof like distant footsteps. He turned another page. Notes described the involvement of certain town authorities and visiting medical researchers. Funding from unnamed sponsors. Promises of improving scientific understanding at the cost of vulnerable people who had no power to refuse. Max pressed close to his side, sensing his shift in breath and posture. The dog's presence steadied him, but the shock of what he had uncovered clouded his thoughts. The cabin was not simply an abandoned structure. It had once been the site of something hidden, something the town had tried to forget. David closed the steel box, though the weight of its contents still pressed against him. He took a few steps back and looked around the small room that had been sealed beneath decades of dust. The air felt colder now, as if memory itself still lingered within the stone walls. He climbed the stairs slowly, with Max following close behind. When he reached the cabin floor, he pulled the metal door shut and lowered the wooden planks into place. The cabin felt different now. Not merely old, but watchful, as though its silence held stories that were not meant to resurface. David sat on the floor beside Max. His mind was still trying to process what he had read. The people harmed, the secrecy, the involvement of authority. Max rested his head on David's leg and breathed slowly, offering a quiet sense of grounding. Outside, the storm continued its steady rhythm against the cabin walls. David stared at the floor where the entrance lay hidden once more. He knew the truth could not stay buried. He also sensed that uncovering it would bring consequences he was not yet ready to face. But tonight, beneath the weight of the old cabin and the sound of relentless rain, he understood one thing clearly. Max had found something they were never meant to see. A cold night wind rolled across the forest as thin clouds drifted low over the treetops. The sky was dark and heavy, and the old wooden cabin sat in a patch of dim moonlight with rain-soaked grass flattening around it. A quiet chill settled in the air, and every distant sound seemed sharper than usual. Inside the cabin, David Miller sat near a small lantern that flickered weakly against the worn walls. The dim light left most of the room in shadow. The floorboards creaked softly beneath his boots with every shift of weight. Max lay near the door, his body stretched forward and his ears lifted as if waiting for something he could not yet see. The dog's thick coat was damp from an earlier walk, and his breathing was slow but alert. David ran a hand through his unshaved jaw and stared at the steel box he had hidden beneath a tarp. The discovery from the hidden room had changed the air inside the cabin. Nothing felt simple anymore. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faded photographs and the notes describing lives harmed in the name of quiet experiments. He felt his chest tighten whenever his thoughts returned to the faces captured in those old images. A sense of guilt grew inside him, as if he had stepped into a story that did not belong to him, yet somehow still depended on him. He remembered the whispers in town, the lowered gazes, the quick steps of people eager to walk away when he approached the counter or passed along the street. At first, he had believed it was just suspicion toward an outsider. But now, he felt something else beneath their unease. People were not avoiding him because of who he was. They were avoiding him because of what he had found. As he sat in silence, a faint rustling sound came from the crack beneath the cabin door. David tensed and leaned forward. Max lifted his head sharply and released a low warning rumble. David reached for the handle and opened the door slowly. The night wind rushed in with a cold bite. A small piece of paper lay crumpled on the doorstep. Someone had pushed it under the door while they slept, or while they had been away gathering firewood earlier that evening. He bent down and picked it up. The paper was rough and folded twice. When he opened it, he saw a short message written with blunt strokes. "Stop digging, or you will regret it. No name, no mark, just a warning." It was the kind of message someone leaves when they have something to hide and no courage to confront it in daylight. David stood still for a moment and looked out into the darkness of the trees as if expecting movement. But the woods were silent. He walked back inside and closed the door. Max approached him, sniffed the paper, then looked toward the window, with a soft growl vibrating through his chest. David crouched and stroked the dog's neck. Max's fur was thick under his hands, and the steady heat of his body grounded him for a moment. But the tremor in Max's muscles revealed that the dog felt danger more sharply than he did. David whispered softly that everything would be fine, though he did not fully believe it. Hours passed. The lantern dimmed further, and rain began to fall with a slow, steady rhythm that echoed across the roof. David tried to rest, lying on the old mattress he had dragged near the warm corner of the room. Max curled beside him, but did not sleep. The dog's eyes stayed half open and kept scanning the darkness. Then, sometime deep into the night, Max lifted his head. His ears rose high and his body stiffened. David woke instantly. He had learned through years of service to trust Max's instincts without question. The dog stared toward the window and let out a short, low sound. Then he moved toward the door with careful steps. David followed without hesitation and reached for the flashlight. But before he could turn it on, Max growled sharply, the sound deep and urgent. A soft thud came from outside, not loud, not clumsy. The kind of sound a person makes when they are trying not to be heard. David's pulse tightened. He approached the window and looked through the cracked glass pane. At first, he saw only darkness and rain. Then, as lightning flashed faintly behind the clouds, he saw a shape move near the edge of the yard. Someone was crouching near the wall of the cabin. The figure was slim and wrapped in dark clothing. David's breath slowed. The person moved with the careful caution of someone who had done this before. He stepped back from the window. Max growled once more, louder this time. The intruder must have heard the sound, because a second later, the cabin door rattled as if someone were trying to test the lock. David braced his hand on the wooden frame. His heart beat in a slow, steady rhythm that reminded him of desert nights when danger crept from hidden corners. He whispered to Max to stay behind him, but Max ignored the command. The dog pressed close to the door and growled fiercely. A soft click sounded at the lock as if someone was trying to pick it. David's breath held. His hand tightened into a fist. Then Max lunged. The dog slammed his body into the wooden door with a sudden burst of force that shook the hinges. The intruder let out a startled sound. Then footsteps scrambled across the porch. David flung the door open. Rain poured in as Max leaped forward and chased the retreating figure into the yard. The person stumbled once on the wet grass, but escaped into the trees, vanishing into the darkness. David called Max back with a firm voice. The dog stopped near the first line of trees. He stood still for a moment before returning, breathing hard. When Max stepped under the lantern light, David saw a thin line of blood along the dog's shoulder. It was not deep, but it was fresh. His chest tightened. He knelt quickly and inspected the wound. Max stood still and pressed his head gently against David's arm. The dog trusted him fully. David felt anger rise slowly inside him. Not wild anger, but something deep and steady. Someone had come into the night chasing the box of documents and had harmed Max in the process. That was a line he would not allow anyone to cross. He cleaned the wound with what little supplies he had. Max tolerated the sting without whimpering. The dog's loyalty was silent, but fierce. Each time David touched the wound, Max looked into his eyes with a steady gaze that said he was ready for whatever came next. David felt a shift inside him as he wrapped the cloth around Max's shoulder. He realized they were no longer simply trying to survive in an old cabin. They were being watched. The secrets buried under the cabin floor were not only dark, but dangerous. And whoever feared the truth was already trying to silence it. He sat beside Max on the floor, listening to the rain. He kept the steel box close. He felt the weight of the secrets trapped inside the old files. They were heavier now than when he had first discovered them. The warnings in town made sense. The danger was real, and it was growing. David leaned back against the wall and looked at Max. The dog rested his head on David's leg, breathing gently. Despite the wound and the fear, Max stayed by his side with absolute loyalty. To David, that loyalty meant more than anything he had left in this world. He whispered quietly that they would get through this together. Outside, the wind blew through the forest with a long, low sound that felt like a distant warning carried through the trees. David knew one truth now. Whatever was hunting the past had begun hunting him too. And Max had already shed blood for the truth they had uncovered. The night settled cold and silent over the forest as a thin fog drifted close to the ground. The sky carried a pale gray tone, and the air felt sharp in David's lungs when he stepped outside the small wooden cabin. The distant sound of wind pressed through the trees like a long whisper, and the cabin lights flickered weakly as if already threatened by something unseen. David returned inside and closed the door, leaning his weight against it for a moment. The strain around his eyes showed how little sleep he had managed since the discovery beneath the house. Max lay close by, his injured shoulder wrapped in a cloth bandage. The dog was alert despite the wound, and his eyes followed David's every movement with steady concern. David knelt beside him, rubbed the fur behind his ear, and whispered that they would get through this. But in his chest, he felt the heavy truth that danger was now circling closer. He sat at the small wooden table and pulled out an old phone from his pack. He had avoided calling anyone from his past for years, but now he needed someone he could trust. His thumb hesitated for a long moment before he pressed the number. The call rang once, then twice. On the third ring, a deep, steady voice answered. Tom Harris speaking. Hearing that voice pulled David back to dusty roads and nights spent guarding unstable outposts. Tom had been his squad mate years ago. Now Tom worked as a lawyer for veterans, a tall man with a broad build, a shaved jaw, and a tired seriousness in his eyes that came from watching too many soldiers struggle after the war. Tom had always carried himself with calm logic and a quiet sense of responsibility. He spoke with a firm tone that made people feel protected. When David explained the situation, Tom listened without interrupting. His breathing was slow and controlled. Finally, he said that David needed more than legal advice. He needed evidence secured. He needed someone outside the threat. Tom connected him to Emma Clark, an investigative journalist known for taking on stories others feared. Emma was in her mid-30s, slim with sharp features, short brown hair, and clear, focused eyes that saw past lies with unsettling ease. Her voice was precise and confident. She asked short, direct questions that told David she did not waste time. Emma carried the tone of someone who had spent years chasing truths that powerful people wanted buried. They agreed to meet at a quiet rest stop a few miles from the cabin. David arrived with Max by his side. Max stayed close, his body tense, as if reading danger not yet visible. When Emma stepped from her small gray car, she moved carefully, scanning the area first. Her posture was poised and ready. She introduced herself with a nod and examined the documents David carried with professional intensity. Tom arrived moments later in a mud-stained pickup truck. He wore a heavy coat and carried a worn messenger bag filled with legal files. His presence felt grounding, like a piece of the past that had survived with him. Inside Tom's truck, they worked in near silence. Emma powered on a rugged laptop and a portable scanner. Her fingers moved quickly. David watched as each page, each photo, and each note from the hidden room was scanned and uploaded into several encrypted storage systems. Tom explained each step calmly as he worked beside her. He had dealt with cover-ups before, and he knew how fragile evidence could be. They stored everything in 3 digital vaults and sent copies to trusted contacts. David felt a small measure of relief as the files transferred, but the relief was brief. Outside, the sky darkened again. A sudden crack of sound echoed across the forest line. Max stood up immediately, body stiff, tail low, eyes aimed at the trees. David's pulse quickened. Something was off. He stepped outside the truck. The cabin lights in the distance flickered once, then went dark entirely. The electricity had been cut. Emma looked up from the laptop with a sharp breath. Tom reached for the flashlight he kept by the seat. David whispered that someone must have followed him. Max let out a low rumble deep in his chest. David turned toward Emma and Tom. They needed to move fast. Whatever group feared the documents was not going to allow them time. When they returned to the cabin, the smell of smoke carried across the air. A small fire had begun near the back wall. Someone had poured accelerant through the cracks of the wood and tried to ignite the cabin to destroy the evidence. But the rain had returned just enough to slow the flames. David grabbed an old bucket and doused the fire, while Max stood guard, ears flicking at every sound. A shadow moved near the edge of the yard. Emma saw it first and whispered a warning. Tom reached for a long stick near the door, gripping it with tense hands. David recognized the pattern of the intruder's movement. This was not random fear. This was intention. This was someone trained or someone desperate. He signaled for Emma and Tom to stay low. Max stayed at his side. The dog's breathing was firm and ready. As the shadow crept closer, David stepped forward with careful certainty. Years of battlefield instincts returned to him. He did not have weapons, only experience and Max's loyalty. That was enough to hold the line. The shadow paused when David approached. Then it fled back into the trees with fast steps that snapped branches underfoot. Max lunged forward, but David held him back. He could not risk the dog reopening his wound. He watched the figure vanish deeper into the darkness, knowing it would not be the last attempt. Inside the cabin, Emma secured the scanned files again, while Tom checked the walls for further signs of tampering. The electricity did not return. Someone had cut the power lines entirely. David sat down for a moment, feeling the weight of fear press hard against his ribs. But he also felt something else rise within him. A spark of determination he had thought he lost long ago. He looked at Tom and Emma. They were risking their safety because he had chosen to uncover the truth. And Max, injured but unwavering, stayed ready at the door. David knew they could not walk away now. The truth was already out of its hiding place, and whoever wanted it buried again would have to face all of them. When the rain eased, Emma packed her equipment. She promised to finish securing the remaining files as soon as she reached a safer location. Tom told David he would begin legal steps to protect him. David nodded with gratitude he struggled to express. He whispered a quiet promise to Max that they would not back down. The night settled once more, but David no longer felt alone. For the first time since stepping into the cabin, he felt supported. And despite the shadows outside, the truth was no longer trapped in the dark. It was moving forward. A clear morning light spread across the valley as thin clouds floated high above the treetops. The air felt crisp and still, carrying the clean scent of pine and damp earth left behind by the night rain. The old cabin stood quiet under the pale sky, its roof glistening with dew and its windows reflecting the first soft glow of day. Inside, David Miller sat at the wooden table with his hands wrapped around a cup of cooling coffee. Max lay at his feet, the thick fur along his neck rising slightly each time a distant bird moved in the trees. The dog's bandage was secure and healing well. His eyes remained alert and bright. David reached down and stroked Max's head. The contact steadied him. Something heavy was about to move through the world, and he felt it in his chest. Emma Clark had worked through the entire night from a safe location a few miles away. She had sent a short message just before dawn saying everything was ready. Emma was a woman who did not fear consequences when she believed the truth mattered. Her resolve had a sharpness to it, shaped by long years of chasing stories powerful people did not want told. She had the focused intensity of a person who lived from deadline to deadline, carrying both bravery and exhaustion in her clear brown eyes. David waited in silence until the small, worn radio on the shelf crackled to life. At first, it was only static. Then the voice of a morning anchor came through, steady and clipped. Reports are coming in. of an explosive investigative piece released overnight. The work of journalist Emma Clark has revealed a network of illegal testing programs run decades ago. Documents indicate a chain of financial transactions tied to several state and local officials. David closed his eyes for a moment. He felt something inside him tighten and then release slowly, like a cord pulled too long. Max sat up straight and looked toward the sound, as if sensing the shift in his owner's breath. The radio continued. According to the report, evidence includes scanned notes, photographs, and hidden records discovered at a rural property by a local veteran named David Miller. A German shepherd named Max was instrumental in uncovering material that had been concealed for more than 30 years. David lowered his head and let out a long breath. He felt no pride, only a solemn weight that came with knowing the truth was no longer locked away in a forgotten room underground. Max nuzzled his arm gently, as if reminding him he was not alone in carrying that weight. Emma arrived later that morning. Her boots were wet from walking through the grass, and her expression was tired but determined. She stepped into the cabin with a steady stride. Her short brown hair was wind-stirred, and her coat carried the faint smell of the forest. She placed her camera bag on the table and gave David a firm nod. She said the story had already spread across the entire state. National stations were picking it up by the hour. The federal agency had confirmed they were launching a full-scale investigation. Tom Harris called moments later. His voice came through firm and steady as always. He said several officials had already been taken into custody. Their names were being discussed openly after years of fear and silence. Tom had seen many kinds of injustice, but he confessed he never thought he would see this case exposed. David heard pride in his voice, mixed with the steady caution of someone who had learned not to trust victory too quickly. Emma turned on her laptop and showed the early broadcast clips. News stations displayed photos from the hidden room, black and white images of the wronged, copies of signed authorizations, lists of payments routed through obscure accounts. Every piece was supported by timestamps and seals. Some names were whispered in the town for years, but had never been proven until now. One broadcaster spoke with urgency. This evidence suggests a deliberate effort to target vulnerable communities. More arrests are expected. Another clip played, showing the cabin and David's truck in the background. The reporter spoke with an even tone. The investigation began after a veteran and his service dog discovered hidden documents inside a sealed room beneath an abandoned property. Authorities confirm the dog named Max uncovered the entrance during a storm. Emma watched the screen with a firm expression. David watched her, seeing how much weight she carried despite her calm. She had made enemies by releasing the story, but she did not show fear. She was lean and sharp-featured, the type whose determination shone through even in stillness. Max barked softly as the radio mentioned his name again. David smiled faintly and scratched behind the dog's ear. Max tilted his head in quiet pride, though his posture remained serious. He seemed to understand the air around them had shifted. As the day moved forward, more broadcasts appeared. News vans gathered at the edge of the remote road. Helicopters passed overhead. Federal officials arrived with somber faces and stiff postures. Their jackets bore agency patches, and their movements were firm and methodical. David answered their questions with clear and measured words. Tom guided him through the statements by phone, ensuring he did not feel overwhelmed. Emma provided digital copies of every file. By late afternoon, the arrests increased. A former state doctor, known for his stiff posture and stern features, was taken from his office. A retired official, with silver hair and deep lines across his brow, was escorted into a black car. Their reputations had once intimidated an entire region. Now they looked small and shaken as the years of hidden wrongdoing rose into daylight. Through it all, Max stayed at David's side. The dog walked slowly, but proudly, his wound almost healed. Reporters called him the dog who unearthed the buried truth. Children who watched the news sent drawings of Max to local stations. Emma showed David the early ones that appeared online. Simple lines of charcoal and crayon capturing a loyal dog standing strong beside a tired man. David felt something warm move through his chest. Not triumph. Something quieter. Something like the return of a part of himself he thought had been lost forever on distant battlefields. Standing in the doorway of the cabin, he looked across the clearing and felt the world return to a shape that made sense again. The truth had risen. Justice had begun. And Max stood in the center of it with calm, unwavering loyalty. A warm, golden light settled gently over the valley as the late afternoon sun filtered through tall pines. The air carried the faint smell of sawdust and fresh soil after a long day of quiet work. A soft breeze moved across the clearing, brushing lightly against the walls of the once ruined cabin that now stood renewed under the name Haven Hollow. David Miller stood on the porch, one hand resting on the wooden railing that he and Tom had finished sanding earlier that morning. Max lay stretched beside him, his fur catching the soft glow of sunlight. The dog raised his head when David shifted his weight and looked up with calm, steady eyes that spoke of loyalty earned through hardship. With the support and compensation granted after the investigation, David had found himself holding something he never expected to have again: a second chance. Tom Harris stood with him through every step. Tom arrived at the cabin early each morning, carrying a toolbox in one hand and a sense of purpose in his broad shoulders. His tall frame and firm features made him appear serious, but beneath that, he carried a constant, quiet kindness. His past in the service had carved lines of discipline along his face, yet he faced this new mission with steady hope. Together, they repaired the broken porch, reinforced the beams, cleared the debris that had gathered across the property, and repainted the cabin in warm tones that reflected the natural colors of the forest. Emma visited on some afternoons to capture the progress for the follow-up to her report. She moved through the space with observant eyes and a soft smile that broke the sharp intensity she usually carried when investigating darker truths. She said Haven Hollow had become something worth showing the world. Inside the cabin, new beds lined the rooms. Fresh blankets sat neatly folded at the foot of each one. Shelves held donated books about healing and recovery. A large table stood at the center of the main room, where coffee mugs and simple meals could be shared. The structure still carried the old bones of the abandoned place it once was, but now the air felt warm and lived in. One by one, veterans began to arrive. Men whose faces carried stories written in deep lines, shoulders that bore years of strain, voices that had learned to stay quiet in their loneliness. Some were older, with gray hair and slow steps. Others were close to David's age, carrying unspoken memories in the slight tremble of their hands or the distant look in their eyes. They came with bags worn from travel and hearts heavy from years of wandering. Haven Hollow accepted them all. Max greeted each one as they stepped onto the porch. The dog would lift his head, walk forward with calm confidence, and place himself in front of them, as if saying they were safe here. Some veterans knelt to scratch behind his ears. Others simply reached out with hesitant hands, surprised to feel such gentle reassurance from a dog they had never met. Max seemed to know exactly who needed comfort most. He moved quietly from one person to another, reminding them through simple presence that they were not alone. David worked through each day with a sense of purpose he had not felt since leaving the battlefield. He helped repair boots, restored framed photos brought by the men, and listened to stories shared in steady voices that sometimes broke into silence. He brewed coffee each morning, its warm scent filling the cabin as the veterans gathered slowly around the large wooden table. Tom guided those who needed legal help, sitting with them for hours, explaining forms in his clear, calm tone. He helped them understand benefits they had forgotten or never claimed. He listened without judgment, offering the kind of reassurance only someone who had walked in their shoes could give. His tall frame moved steadily through the rooms, a reminder of stability. Emma visited again as Haven Hollow welcomed its fifth veteran. She walked in carrying her camera, but left it on the table after seeing the group gathered by the fire pit. She sat with them and listened. Her sharp eyes softened when she saw Max curl up beside a man who had not spoken in days. She later told David that Haven Hollow was no longer just a shelter. It had become a living testimony of resilience. As evening settled, the porch filled with quiet laughter. Someone told an old story from deployment. Another man shared a memory he had not dared to speak aloud in years. The sound of voices carried across the clearing like warm echoes of life returning to a place once abandoned. David stepped outside and stood on the porch, letting the golden light settle across his face. He looked out at the men drinking coffee, leaning back in old chairs, speaking to each other with ease. The long years of silence in their hearts were beginning to lift. Max moved beside him and pressed against his leg. David rested a hand on the dog's head, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath. He looked at the cabin that had once been feared, a place no one wanted, bought for $100 because no one believed it deserved more. Now it was filled with warmth, conversation, and the slow rebuilding of broken spirits. David felt his chest loosen. The weight of the past had not disappeared, but it no longer controlled him. He saw hope reflected in the soft glow of lamps through the cabin windows. He heard healing in the voices carried by the evening breeze. From a home once abandoned and burdened with dark secrets, Haven Hollow had become a refuge of light, a place where broken paths found new direction, a home shaped not by bricks or wood, but by the people who gathered within its walls and the loyal dog who had led them toward the truth. David remained on the porch for a long moment. He breathed in the quiet air and felt at peace for the first time in years. Haven Hollow stood strong behind him. The veterans shared soft laughter ahead of him, and Max sat by his side, the beating heart of the home they had created. In the quiet valley where Haven Hollow now stands, the story of David and Max becomes more than a tale of survival. It becomes a reminder that healing often begins in the smallest places, where people choose kindness over fear and hope over silence. The abandoned cabin once carried shadows of the past, yet through courage and compassion, it grew into a refuge where broken spirits found comfort again. David learned that no one heals alone, and that community becomes a lifeline when the world feels heavy. Max showed how loyalty can guide a lost heart back toward the light. Their journey reflects the quiet miracles that unfold when people choose to stand together even in hardship. It reminds every listener that blessings can rise from the most unexpected places. May this story encourage those who hear it to keep faith in the goodness ahead. If this message warms your heart, please share it with others. Leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, and join in a simple prayer for peace and strength in your daily life. May God watch over you and bless your path with hope and gentle light.